Hey guys, welcome to the Mom Show. I'm your host, Courtney Doyle, and this is a place I am giving you permission to not have it all together. Hey guys, welcome back to the show. Today, my guest is Amy Loflin. Amy, I am immediately going to turn the microphone over to you because would you
Great.
introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me. It is wonderful to just step into your space that you've been creating. So thank you. It's an honor and a joy. So yes, my name is Amy Loflin. I am an author, speaker, life coach, and also the co-founder of Echo Joy Collective, which is an organization that strives to help everyday women create space with God in their lives. And so that's a very broad introduction of that. But I am a mom and a wife. I have been married to my husband, Chad. We just celebrated our 29th anniversary. So I think we are right behind Scott and you. I know you just
Yeah.
celebrated your 30th back in the fall, right?
Yeah, in
Is that
September.
right? Yes, yes. A lot we learn in a few decades. And then, yes, we are empty nesters now. So we have two sons. Jacob is our oldest. He is almost 25 and is living in DC. And our youngest is Ben, and he is graduating from NC State University next month. And I am in Cartersville, North Carolina, which is a small town, but it's smack dab in the middle of High Point, Winston, Greensboro area in central North Carolina. And so born and raised in this
Oh, I
area.
love North
So
Carolina too.
I
It's
do
so
too.
beautiful.
Oh,
It's
it is
so beautiful.
amazing. Me
So
too.
I'm going to take you back to when
Okay.
Ben was little, and there was a
Mhm.
moment on a beach with Ben. Will you tell the listeners about that story?
Yes. So this was, I would say, one of the most significant pivotal moments in my motherhood journey. We were, like you mentioned, we were at the beach and it was 4th of July. And in that season of our lives, this was a bit of a tradition that we would meet several friends at the beach for the 4th. And it was a reunion type celebration. And like you mentioned, the boys were younger. Ben was 2.5, and Jacob, that would have put him at about 5. So it was a fun day. And I was chatting with some friends. And at some point, I realized that I could not find Ben. And I knew in that moment he was not wearing a life jacket. There were people everywhere. And I think, like most people, most parents that have experienced that all of a sudden realizing that you don't have eyes on your child in a public place and all the little things that can quickly race through your mind. And so I'd quickly pick up my pace and I start looking around for him. And I would say it might have been 30 seconds at the most until I laid eyes with him on him. And he was playing in the water with a friend of mine who's perfectly safe. And so my adrenaline came down and I could relax and enjoy the day. But there was something that had triggered in my mind a very specific, nuanced phrase that would not let me go. And so it wasn't until I would say later that evening, and then really even the next day, we were driving home and the boys were asleep in the back seat, and Chad and I were processing it, that I was able to really start putting some words around it because realized the normal, what I would say a normal reaction in any mom or dad in that experience, the phrases that are going to pop in your head are, oh no, where's my child? What's happened to him? And maybe even start playing out some of those fears. But what actually popped in my head in that moment was, oh no, so it's going to be Ben.
Mm.
And as I mentioned at first, I found him and things were fine, but that phrase just kept gnawing at my thoughts and wondering what that was a little an oddly nuanced phrase. And so it was then that I realized that I wasn't just afraid that something had happened to Ben. I expected something bad to have happened to Ben. Like I was waiting for it. And it was then, as I processed it, in prayer and then also with Chad that I realized I had been living in a state of anticipation and anticipatory grief.
That's interesting. Amy, you talk about this anticipated grief and the reaction, I agree with you, is different in thinking it, I knew it was going to be Ben versus is he in the water? Did somebody take him? The other fear reactions that we would have had, and you label that as anticipated grief. When was this the first time you realized that you were living like that? Or were there other signs leading up to this moment that this may be a pattern that I'm stuck in?
That's a great way to put it. First of all, I would say my husband seemed to recognize it before I did. There were a few conversations that we had before this occurrence on the beach where he would lovingly, very tenderly try to point out that he felt like, at least to a degree, that I was holding him at arm's length, that I was not all in like he wanted me to be. And Courtney, I could say every time he would bring that up, I would honestly feel dumbfounded. I really could not grasp or understand what he was referring to. But thanks to that pivotal circumstance on the beach and then how we then processed it, it was as if God lovingly just allowed those shingles to fall off and connections started to take place. And I was able to connect some of these dots. But recognizing and realizing that it stemmed from some early suffering and early pain, early grief in my life. When I was 21 years old, my mom died of a sudden heart attack when she was 52. And I would say that my mom and I were very close. We had a wonderful relationship. She was an incredible woman. And so when I experienced this sudden loss, it completely rocked my world. It was a tidal wave of grief. I remember trying to explain that I had no idea that such grief could even, or pain could even exist. And so, yes, I think that subconsciously, I didn't even realize I was doing this, but through my process of grief, there was a part of me that was trying to, as if it's possible, but trying to protect myself from ever experiencing that level of pain again. It was as if I thought, I can't survive another one. It was way too difficult. And so if I just go ahead and start grieving the most important people in my life, then it's not going to hurt quite as much. Maybe not even if, but what I felt like was a win when something happened to them. Because grief is illogical, right? It's irrational. But it's absolutely what I realized what I was doing. I had built this wall of protection around my heart. Yeah.
Do you think that you were parenting? Your husband noticed, hey, you're keeping me at arm's length. Were you doing the same with the children?
I think I must have been. Again, I didn't see how I was doing that to Chad, but he did. And I'm sure, even though I couldn't see examples of how I might have been doing it with the boys, I'm sure that I was. Because for some reason, I remember even as a child, my biggest fear was something happening to my mom. There were, every now and then I would cry myself to sleep, just worrying something would happen to my mom. And so when something did, suddenly I lived in a world where the worst case scenario happened. And I think that state of anticipatory grief, it's that living in a sense of that the worst case scenario is just around the corner. And it's that permeating sense of doom that is just waiting to catch you off guard again. And so it's that heightened sense of a fight or flight or preparing for that worst case scenario. And yes, I know it did affect the way I parented and connected with the boys in those early years. Yeah.
I think so many people can resonate with that. You're talking and I'm thinking, Uh-oh.
Mm,
Uh-oh.
mm,
Do I do that?
mm.
Because so few people could honestly sit or listen and say, I haven't experienced anything traumatic. It may not be the
Right.
sudden loss of a parent, but it could be any kind of trauma that where you have lost someone, a relationship. Maybe it's not even through death, it's
Sure.
through whatever it may be, estrangement or whatever it may be. And then you do anticipate. I can relate to that in the sense of having 6 children and having
Mm.
our oldest has struggled for many years with addiction. And so I can see in what you're saying, really having to battle those lies that
Mm.
this is going to happen to someone else, another one of the children, or something bad's going to happen to one of the other children. And so I can really relate to what you're saying. I've never given it a name though. And
Mm.
so this anticipatory grief after this incident with Ben, when you were like, what in the heck was that reaction? Was that the turning point for you where you
Mm.
said, I can't live like this anymore?
Absolutely. And thank goodness it literally was a pivotal, meaning that it course corrected me in a significant way to the point that I think when we are blessed with that much grace to allow those shingles to come down, that's where our grit comes from, of where I'm like, oh, wow, no. It's almost this visceral response of, I am never going back to that because I realized that I mentioned the relationship that I had with my mom was such a beautiful connection that I didn't want to deprive my sons of that. I knew they deserved a mom that was all in. My husband deserved a wife that was all in. I deserved a life of bountiful, abundant connection with the incredible people that God has put in my life. And so, yes, it was that feeling of recognizing I cannot allow fear that then leads to a tendency of perfectionism or people pleasing or control, any of those tendencies to then be a barrier in the relationships that I knew were possible with the closest
Mhm.
people in my life. Yeah.
I could definitely see as a mom where if you're living in this constant state of waiting for the other shoe to drop kind of thing,
Right.
anticipated grief, okay, what's going to happen next? It could very easily force us into a state of control and you're going to stop the what ifs from happening.
Right.
How was that if you could look back? I know that you said Chad had mentioned this distance, but what are some other ways that you feel like maybe you were losing connection or you were missing out on things without even realizing it?
Yes, I think that beyond the wall of protection that I was experiencing as I was healing and, of course, going through therapy and doing a lot of that heart work through the grief process, because it's certainly a process, it's layered. There's always things to peel back. I realized another huge natural consequence of my grief was that what rocked my world by her sudden death, I realized at some point that I had essentially put her on a pedestal, that she was probably not ahead of Jesus, but maybe right there neck and neck. She was an idol. She had the gift of encouragement. I was blessed with a mom that filled my bucket, and that was a wonderful gift, and I am so grateful for that. But one of the natural consequences that I realized, again, throughout my healing journey was that when she died, there was a part of my worth and value and security that died with her. My identity died with her. And so it wasn't until, again, the grace of God helped me to recognize and see where that happened and how it happened, that I realized Jesus is the only one that needs to be on that pedestal. He is my creator. He is the one that says who I am and whose I am, and the worth and the value and my true identity is alone in him. And I say that because it really became an important piece of my motherhood journey in two ways. One was because I knew I never wanted to take that place for my boys. And secondly, I never wanted to erroneously put them on that pedestal and to be my idols. And so it's that constant, again, that course correction of paying attention, staying self-aware, and recognizing that I needed to make sure those relationships were always stable in the correct order. Yeah.
But what are some practical tips that you could
Mm.
give the mom who's saying, oh,
Yeah.
I may be doing that with my children. I may have my
Mhm.
children on a pedestal or another loved one, or they've lost that pedestal person in
Mhm.
their life and they haven't realized, no, Jesus, let's put him in his rightful
Mm.
place. What would be some practical steps or tips that you could share?
I would say, of course, it's fixing our eyes on Jesus. It's that constantly paying attention to what's stirring in us. And one of my favorite words is curiosity, and giving ourselves the grace of curiosity. And so that maybe, let's say it's a temptation of signing our kids up for a lot of activities. It's pausing and being curious. Why why are we making these decisions? And is this what's best for our kids? Or am I somehow, is there anything in me that is tying my identity to this? And just being tender with ourselves and exploring that. I think it's also giving our kids the freedom to fail and also recognizing that our worth or value isn't dependent on their decisions, on what they do, what they say, how they act, and giving them the grace and the space to figure that out without feeling the burden of carrying our identities and worth on their shoulders.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing
Yeah.
that you mentioned that. I was just having a conversation about that very thing. And sometimes we
Really.
are signing our kids up for lots of things because we feel like we have to do it because other people are doing it. Maybe it's fulfilling something in us, a dream that we
Sure.
never got to accomplish. And so, what are some other things? Because you said you want to make sure your boys don't grow up. Like you had placed your mom on this pedestal for rightful reasons. Like you said, she was incredible, obviously, what you're
Mm.
saying. What are some ways that you have prevented or tried to prevent your boys from doing the same with you?
Yes, I think some of the biggest things is even when they were children, I've got a few things that come to mind. We always tried to make sure that our family unit was Jesus first, marriage second, boys third. That little things, even when they were little, Chad and I were very intentional. We wanted them to see that the marriage was so central, that if we were hugging or dancing in the kitchen and the boys like, "Oh, me too, mom and dad." It was, "Hold on just a second. It's mom and dad time." And then invite them in. Even of little things like when we would sit at church, it was mom and dad. You don't sit between mom and dad. You sit beside us, not between us. It's just those little bitty things like that we just were intentional with. And I would say too, another thing that comes to mind, and I received this from a conversation that I had with a dear friend, Allison, that from years ago, whenever I say goodbye to the boys, whether it's on a phone call or a hug goodbye and they're going back to school or back to their home, is I say, remember who you are. And their response back is, and whose you are.
Oh,
And it's because, when you're sending them off to kindergarten for the first time, or years later, you're packing them off and you're sending them off into a dorm or wherever that is. And it's that urgent feeling of all of a sudden you just want to tell them all of the advice all at once. Make good choices and remember who to make friends with. And it's all of that. You want to cram all of that into them as quickly as possible.
right.
But honestly, what it comes down to is remember who you are, because first and foremost their identity. And then with them knowing to respond back and whose you are, because then it's God's identity. And I remember having a conversation with Jacob a few years ago as I wanted to make sure he understood what those two phrases meant. And he said, it's about being a Loflin. It's about being a part of our family. And I said, yes, absolutely it is. But it's bigger than that. It points back to the foundation of your faith. And because again, I know that bad things happen, that there can be external circumstances that may be fragile. But again, that security and knowing that he is who God says that he is. My boys are who God says they are, and that their identity is set because we can trust that he is who he says he is. So
I have a kiddo that was just leaving to go away for a work trip, and there were some things. And one of the things that my husband will say a lot of times is he'll say the same thing, remember who you are, remember what name you represent. And a lot of times that's our family name. And this particular kiddo is actually named after my father-in-law, who was an incredible man and very admired and well-loved in his community. He was in the sheriff's department. And so when we named kiddo number 2 after his grandfather, who had passed away at a young age due to cancer. So we've raised him always saying, hey, don't forget whose name you carry. But I love what you're saying, because really that's what we should be telling all of our kids. Don't forget whose name you carry. And it's not our surname, our last name. It's the name of Jesus, and as believers, and don't forget that you carry his name in everything that you do. Yes. I think that's such a sweet reminder. I want to shift. You wrote a book, A Story Worth Living, and it was birthed out of a deeper pursuit for you of Jesus, but it's the story of the bleeding woman. How did that connect with your journey and the hope that you're longing for each mom to take away with that message?
Yes. So you're right. A journey or a story worth living was not something that I sat down to write a book. It was definitely birthed from a very intimate season that I experienced with Jesus, and a season and time where I felt like a holy stirring in me for more of him and to go deep instead of just wide. I had read the Bible cover to cover before, and I think that's a wonderful practice. I encourage anyone to do that. But I knew for this specific season, I wanted to, again, fix my eyes on Jesus and go deep. And so I chose a few encounters that people had with Jesus throughout Scripture and spent a month in each one. And one of those was the story of the bleeding woman, the story that's found in Luke chapter 8 of this courageous, amazing woman who reaches out in bold faith and touches the cloak of his garment and receives immediate healing. And so that was a beautiful, tender moment, very personal with me and Jesus. And then fast forward a few years later, there's a variety of steps that kind of led me to the place of sharing it publicly. And even when I first started to write it down, I didn't anticipate it becoming a book. It just suddenly turned into 22 chapters of what we can learn from this incredible story when we really immerse ourselves in that scene, placing ourselves in her shoes and experiencing that. What I really have been enjoying is hearing from some of the early readers and how different pieces of the book and her story are connecting in different ways with women. And I know you experience that as a podcaster. It could be one line from one conversation that you have, and one of your listeners says, well, that was for me. So I love hearing about that because the book really does touch on so many different topics, from shame and suffering to body confidence to connection with other women and people pleasing, all the topics. But I would say leaning in, especially to the conversation that we're having currently that spoke back to that. There's a beautiful line in the story in Luke chapter 8. It's verse 47. And it's when she knew she could no longer stay hidden, she began to tremble and fell to her knees in front of him. And that one sentence alone, there's so much there that we get to unpack and explore. But I think one of the most healing lines from that, again, when we take our time and immerse ourselves into an encounter with him, and we explore those few little words, when she knew she could no longer stay hidden. And we start to question and ask ourselves and ask Jesus to reveal, what am I hiding from?
Mm-hmm.
And what am I hiding behind? And who told me that I needed to hide? And when we really sit in those words in his presence and open our hearts to what he wants to reveal to us and for us, it's so healing. And re-examining some of the things from my own story and realizing I was hiding behind control. I was hiding behind trying to be the perfect mom. I was hiding from potential grief, additional suffering that might be around the corner. But talking with other women, it comes in so many different forms and fashions. Whether we're hiding from something or we're allowing life to dim our light or to quiet our voices when God wants to be using them. And again, I just like that moment on the beach. I think when we take that time to explore even just that little piece of it, it's pivotal. That's where that grit comes in, when we do realize that we've been hiding or dimming our light or silencing our voices. That is, oh, wow, no, there is an abundance that's waiting for me on the other side of this, and I am not going back to that place of hiding.
And when you talk of her, thinking of her
Mm.
grit and her determination and what she had to do in that moment to get to Jesus, to get through the
Right.
crowd, to be exposed in front of all of these people, the fear she must have felt,
Yeah.
but nothing was getting in her way.
Mm.
She had blinders on and she was headed to
Amen.
Jesus. And I think that's a great message for all of us to remember that we can surrender ourselves and we can pull up our bootstraps and have that courage. And when we put those blinders on and we say, no, we're headed straight to him, then
Yes.
he can heal anything that we're bringing to the table. There's no question about that.
It's so true. It's so true. And you're absolutely right. I mean, tying it into her story, the courage and the boldness, because like you just said, she literally had to walk through the sea of pain. The people who had ostracized her and shamed her for her condition and misunderstood her literally had to walk right through them with the fear of them calling her out, only because her eyes were laser focused on him.
And I'm sure this wasn't an easy path. I envision her using her elbow. She's pushing people out of the way. And shouldn't we
beautiful.
all be that desperate and that determined to get to the feet of Jesus in all circumstances?
Amen.
Move over. I'm coming.
Yes. Yeah, there's nothing that's going to stop me. I love that. Sharpen your elbows, ladies.
Right. Absolutely. I close every session asking if there's something you're praying for that we could join you in prayer. And
Great.
do you have a verse that you would like to share? And you're welcome to share the one you just did if you want, or if there's another one
Sure.
you'd want to share.
Yes. First of all, thank you for the prayer. I always covet any kind of intercessory prayer. So thank you for that. I would ask for just prayers over a story worth living and the hearts that are going to be engaging and experiencing this journey for themselves, and just for God to use it as a tool and a resource to love his daughters, for healing, to challenge them, to grow them, to reveal more of his love and his goodness that is specific for them, and just wanting that to be that healing and an intimate, personal journey for each of them. So would love prayers over that and just to continue to see how he wants to use this resource for his goodness. And then,
Absolutely.
yes, so thank you for that. And yes, I would say it would be that verse of Luke 8:47, when she knew she could, when she knew she could no longer be hidden, she began to tremble and fell to her knees in front of him. And just one more little highlight from that word tremble just really stopped me in my tracks, because as I was exploring this story and imagining it, I think the first few times I had heard that story, I glossed over it and I assumed she was trembling out of fear because she was living probably in a state of anticipatory grief because of the life that she had experienced. And that tremble of, oh no, I just made this rabbi dirty because I just touched him and made him ceremonially unclean. Is the crowd going to turn on me? Is he going to turn on me? But what Luke was sure to point out before that line was that she knew she had immediately been healed. And then it comes, we can recognize then she wasn't trembling out of fear. She was trembling out of awe because she realized she was looking into the face of God. And so just being able to be on our knees in her position and to look into his face is just it's a glorious moment.
Tears to my eyes as you speak that, and I envision her.
Yes, it's just
So good.
so tender.
Thank you so much, Amy, for
Oh,
your time and your message, your wisdom. It's been a lovely time with you.
thank you, Courtney. And again, thank you for inviting me into your space and just chatting with a girlfriend. It's been wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
right. That's right. Thanks so much for listening to The Mom Show with Courtney Doyle. Remember to check the show notes for any links, books, or resources that are mentioned in each episode. We want to be sure this blesses other mothers. And in order to do this, if you're listening via podcast, be sure that you like and share. If you could write a review, that would be fantastic. It helps us get in front of other moms. If you're watching via YouTube, be sure to hit that subscribe button. This way, you won't ever miss an episode. We want to make sure that we increase our reach to other mothers who need a little encouragement, a community, and a whole lot of Jesus. We're so glad you're here.